African anti-apartheid activist and former Speaker of the Limpopo Provincial Legislature. Let's take you there.
Long live the spirit of Dr. Tshenuwani Farisani, long live. Program directors, bafunzi, nebutaru, nabochitereke matibe, Mutawa Farisani, Botobere bane baone pan.
All right, we continue there in Limpopo for you, and that's President Cyril Ramaphosa now on the podium at the funeral service of Dean Tshenuwani Farisani. I'm told we have that line back on. Let's listen in.
Members of the judiciary, Baranga Panda Badzangano, the African National Congress, Rechita Kara Ubana Mwareli Muhurane, Bofikile Mbalula, Anera Deidori, Achitua Namusi, Ave Oguda Ruvenda. Dirumeri se Namuzura Chiduro, Wadzangano, Wapano, Limpopo, Namumwareli, Wadzangano, Wapano Limpopo, Nabaranga Panda ba Alliance, Ine yaitwanga South African Communist Party, Kosatu, na Sanku. Ilimeli ise Nabaranga Panda, Bazikereke Ngamanda, wa Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southern Africa. Ilimeli ise Nabaranga Panda, wa Ino University of Venda. Yenda vyanda wa chancellor yayo ndi chitu chuhurwane ngamahamba Kai University. Fellow mourners and South Africans, Namusi ri kuvhangana roṱhe nga mbilu dzi lemelaho. Ndi muṅwe wa vhe a vhona vho Dr Farisani vhe sibadela vha tshi khou vha zwanḓani zwa madokotela manzhi manzhi. Zwo mbaisa mbilu nga maanḓa ndi tshi pfa upfhi condition yavho a i khou tou vhonala zwavhuḓi. Zwi a konḓa u amba nga vhutshilo ha muthu we a vha e mukomana kha nṋe, e khonani i sa dzinginyeiho, e mueletshedzi, e mutikedzi kha zwithu zwinzhi. His life bears witness to the mission of Christ espoused in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has chosen me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind and to set the oppressed free. We have lost an extraordinary man who led an extraordinary life. Obituary heinoni yu valiwao amwana wabo Tshenuwani. The obituary ine ya angareza vutshilo habo Tshenuwani nga udala. Rokhelelwa nga muthu o khetheaho we a tshila vhutshilo ho khetheaho. Rozipfa uri was born in 1948, a year that was a turning point in the history of our country. This was the year when the National Party swept to power and ushered in the reviled and evil system of apartheid that was declared a crime against humanity by the United Nations. Dean Farisani was born into circumstances that mirrored the lives of millions of black South Africans at the time. He was just a child, barely 3 years old, when his family was confronted with the ugly face of injustice. Many years later, in 1996, he would testify at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on how his family became victims of forced removals from Songozwi near Makado, or Luitrichad, now Makado. The authorities arrived one day without warning, and his parents were ordered to vacate the area immediately. He recounted how they had to carry their belongings on their backs and leave on foot. That which could not be carried, including all the family's livestock, was left behind. They were relocated to another empty piece of land and told that this was their new home. They were never compensated for the land that was stolen from them. The same happened to many other families. And Mukoni Rachitanga, the international relations advisor to Deputy President Mashatile, wrote, quite a moving article which was published yesterday. And he relates the context of the time and what was happening then. Many families were subjected to brutal removals, including my own family on my mother's side, who were moved from Gertrudsburg to Madombija, and that act alone introduced poverty, extreme poverty, into my mother's family. Coming back to Dean Farisani's family, 8 years later in 1959, the family was forcibly removed again. 2 years later in 1961, again they were moved. And Tshenuwani Farisani, the poet and evangelist, recounted these acts of removal and dispossession in a poem that he wrote, and he said, "You pushed me from the fifth of the country to the homelands. You fed me a bogus independence. You made me a citizen of a banana republic and made babies my rulers. You banned me from my country of birth and called me citizen undetermined." These experiences instilled in him a deep sense of understanding injustice. They planted in the mind and the heart of Dr. Tshenuwani Farisani the seeds of his political consciousness when he was still in his teens. Dr. Farisani described this moment of his political consciousness by saying, "Before I knew the word politics, I had already been removed with my community 3 times to make room for whites in newly declared white areas. Before I knew the word apartheid, I had already been denied timely education and daily bread. Before I learned anything about percentages and equality, I already knew that white meant more food, more land, more money, more cattle, better housing, better schooling, better health facilities. Before I heard the word terrorist, I was already being tortured and terrorized. Before I knew the concepts of oppression and exploitation, I knew that our people were killed and buried on the Betal potato farms. Before I knew the word communist, as defined by Botha and his petty politicians, my grandfather had already told me that whites do not love us, they hate us. Hunger amongst blacks is not a natural disease, but a part that created tool of production. If blacks were edible, whites would have barbecues every day. This is what Tshenuwani Farisani wrote. Tshenuwani Farisani only entered, as we heard, formal schooling at the age of 12. Like most children in rural areas at the time, he became a child laborer on white farms. At school, a missionary from the Evangelical Lutheran Church, as we heard, noticed his academic brilliance and believed that he was prepared to enter theological training. It was at Maphumulo Theological Seminary in KwaZulu-Natal that he first became acquainted with the Black consciousness movement. He had been one of the most brilliant students of his generation. When he met me, he was enrolled at this theological college in Natal in preparation for a career in the church. He was even at that time given to traveling, as we heard from his son. He would travel across the country, speaking to young people, distributing literature, establishing organizational branches, and articulating his radical and what others would call subversive ideas. The teachings that he was propagating fired his political awareness. For him, there was no contradiction between the teachings of his faith and the mission of national liberation. Farisani argued that the Lutheran Evangelical Church must turn away from political conservatism and become an instrument of opposition to oppression. For him, black people were in South Africa, but not of South Africa. Every square inch human, but not members of the human race. We have the sense, but not credited with the consciousness of our surroundings, he said. We are present, but always very absent. And he asked why. The Lutheran Church, my own childhood church, was indeed conservative, charging members to respect the institutions of the government that God had created. Farisani rebelled against the dubious teachings of the Lutheran Theological College at Maphumulo, from which he would be expelled in March 1972, deriding as nonsense its teachings that God created the lion to feed upon the buck. Why should blacks complain about white oppression? Likewise, he ridiculed the notion that whenever you find yourself, God has placed you there, so do not complain. Dean Farisani soon became attracted to liberation theology and its message that the true Christian faith demands active resistance to all forms of oppression and solidarity with the poor. Apartheid was a great injustice, and he, the heroic heart that he had, was not content to choose a quiet life of pastoralism. He was eventually expelled, as I said, and he became involved with the underground political organizations like the Black People's Convention, the Black Consciousness Movement. By then he was at Buster Mission, at Maungani outside Thohoyandou, and a rising figure in the Black Consciousness Movement, going on to be elected as president in 1973. In his many travels, Dean Farisani came to speak at my high school, Mpapuli High School. Farisani was a guest at our school's flourishing debating society, which a number of us, including Judge Raulinga, Chifiwa Mwope, and people like Willie Mudau had set up. Dean Farisani and I formed an immediate and lasting bond of friendship, comradeship, and loyalty based on respect and love. He opened to me the radical interpretations of the Bible for which Farisani was later to become famous. He argued the Lutheran Church must turn away from, yes, political conservatism and become an instrument of opposition. For him, this was the best way to move forward. He illuminated the contradictions between the professed faith of Lutherans and the reality of their practiced life. They confessed Christ, yet almost all their actions were contrary to Christ's teachings, he said. At the center of the church, he believed, should be the understanding that God loves everyone and that his Son died for everyone. Yet the Lutheran Church practiced apartheid even in its own organizational structures, he said. A church must teach if it is to be a living church. The Lutherans' teaching at that time was selective and inconsistent, he claimed. Leaders of the church turned a blind eye to the past loads, to the past raids and detentions and killings that were experienced by ordinary people. For him, the inner justice of the church, its preoccupation with the transformation of the heart, had to be accompanied by an outer righteousness or external justice in the transformation of the social and economic order of our country. His later writings bear witness to a profound anger at the treatment of black people by white people, and he was able to give voice to the rage that otherwise lay unspoken in the chests of young people whose consciousness he raised. A number of us, including patriots like Chipiwa Mwope, who was finally brutally killed by the so-called Venda police of the so-called Venda Independent Republic, were more than ready for the radical message Farisani was preaching. Our first collaboration was primarily organizational rather than theological. Together we set up the Black Evangelical Youth Organization right here in Venda, which was called BEYO, a Christian youth organization that evangelized widely and systematically in communities in regions around Sibasa. Our approach was to identify a village and then spend a week there preaching and raising the consciousness of our people. Dean Farisani was not one who yearned for the limelight and to positions. He saw himself as a mentor, and indeed he was my mentor, and he was my teacher as well. BEYO grew rapidly in size and in the scope of its activities. And when I say he was not one for positions, even at that young age, he allowed it that I should be the chairman of the organization and he the deputy. And he was a very good deputy, but very, very vocal. For many years we worked alongside each other in the organization. There were many points in the life of the great man that we are laying to rest today, where he found himself severely and sorely tested. During the late 70s and 80s, he was arrested on a number of occasions, as we have heard, for his political activities. but it was his third detention in 1981 that he found his courage truly tested, his faith severely tested as well, and his principles also tested. He was detained by the Venda police on suspicion of being involved in the bombing of a police station here in Sibasa. He was held for more than 8 months and he was severely tortured. I would think the same level of torture that was finally used to kill Chipiwa Moape, my friend as well. In his book, Diary from a South African Prison, Dean Farisani recounts the unimaginable ordeal of beatings, electric shocks, being forced to squat for days and being smothered. In an interview given years later, he recounts how his torturers tried everything to force a confession from him, even offering him the position of Bishop of Venda. And yet he, strong in will, did not yield. Dean Farisani was a courageous revolutionary who inspired a generation to reclaim their pride and to stand up for their rights. I was one of those who were hugely inspired by him. He was a beloved father, as we have heard, and a grandfather who will be sorely missed by his wife, Momudzunga, his daughters, and his son, and also by his extended family. He was, in addition to everything else, a renowned academic, a prolific scholar whose writings gave voice to the voiceless. He was a guide and a mentor to many. And he was a dear friend to many as well, as we also heard from our premier. And yet it is Dean Farisani's most resilient quality that I will most remember him for. He was a man of unwavering principle. Nothing could sway him from what was right, from his dedication to the cause of the people of South Africa and to their total emancipation. In detention, he was offered positions and status, and he refused them. When he was released and went to exile to the United States, he could have easily put the entire experience behind him and led a quiet life. Instead, he campaigned vigorously against the apartheid regime abroad. When Venda was proclaimed a so-called independent homeland by the apartheid regime, he was one of those who was outspoken in his opposition, even when this brought him into conflict with church leaders in his circuit. His activism continued into the democratic era. He was determined to be part of the struggle as led by his organization, the African National Congress, to overcome injustice and inequality that was bred of apartheid. He was elected to the first Democratic Parliament, 1994, as we heard. He would go on to serve as an MEC here in Limpopo and as a speaker in the legislature. These roles placed him in a position of power and influence. Yet they did not change him. He did not succumb to the allure of high office. He was never arrogant. Hangovia afana na vane radzula ri chitangana navo namusi vane vari arali vopiwa zvidzulo zva ushumela rushaka vatonga vasedzera vamwe vathu pasi vane nga zvimwe zvifhinga wapfa vachisema vathu vachivona unga vone ndi va vuthogwa u fhira vathu vothe. Farisani, he was a servant leader who came, served and left. Bobe vasi mutu we abachido farela kachizulu na ochifingha cha ufuwa choswika. And he continued to contribute to the betterment of his beloved country. He did not regard loyalty to a political cause or a party as being above his own principles. When he saw corruption being perpetrated by those entrusted with public funds, he was vocal and scathing in his criticism. And that is why he was one of those when the VBS looting happened, he spoke out. He spoke out to a point where a number of people started to hate him, but it never moved him. The foundation that bears his name continues to be an influential voice in the public space in advancing social justice, including for apartheid's many victims. Neither beatings nor torture could make Dean Farisani surrender his principles. The trappings of power did not interest him at all. If there ever was a person who lived an ordinary life without the trappings of any sort of wealth or power, it is Dean Farisani. He was content to walk in the footsteps of his Lord with the downtrodden, the oppressed, and the marginalized. He understood his life's mission, and it was not negotiable. These are the greatest lessons we take from his life. These are the reflections we take today as we lay this great son of South Africa to rest. To the family, we share in your grief and your sorrow. Yet even amidst our mourning, we celebrate a man who has left such a deep and lasting impact on all of us. He was an inspiration, certainly. Here is a reflective and respectful message at the funeral of a man of high stature. As we say farewell to this remarkable soul, we should celebrate a life that is well lived, a life that is lived with conviction, with purpose and extraordinary vision. Dean Farisani was not just a leader in title, but a beacon of hope, integrity and justice. And he adhered to his principles. And we honor him for that, and we thank him for having been such a great gift to all of us. And it is this that we need to uphold. As a lifelong member of his organization, the ANC, he, as a leader of the Veterans League, was focused on the renewal of his organization. so that it could live up to the values he subscribed to. And we should honor not only the Dean in words, but we should also honor him in actions. Let us be more just, more kind, and more courageous, because that is what Dean Farisani would have wanted. This is how his legacy as an ANC leader will endure. In Dean Farisani's book of poetry titled Justice in My Tears, and as I said, he was a prolific writer, he writes a very moving poem, and it is called The Lord is My Shepherd, Psalm 23, in Pietermaritzburg and Howick. It was published in 1977, the period of his first imprisonment. In it he writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not buckle. He rests me in the land of freedom. I drink from the cup of liberty. Even when I wander in the valley of torture, I shall fear no human beasts. He shall fight my fight. His angels and his visions guide me through the brutal interrogations. He gives me life in the hands of murderers, giving me a crown for a victory his own." Tshenuwani Farisani, yours was a life of service to others. As the South African people, we crown you as you go to your eternal rest. In the words of Psalm 23, you so loved. Surely goodness and mercy did follow you all the days of your life. May you dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Farewell, my brother, my good comrade, my friend, my mentor, and indeed, my patriot. I thank you.
Eulogy delivered there by President Cyril Ramaphosa as he pays tribute to Dr. Tshenuwani Farisani, detailing his lifelong commitment to the liberation of the people of South Africa and the healing of the nation. Now, he says this was a man whom, when he was just 3 years old, he and his family were forcibly moved from their home and they carried their few belongings on their backs and walked. He says he was an enduring symbol of the injustice that so many endured at the time.